Most people think building something gives you control. You design it, you shape it, you decide how it works, and because you understand it, you assume you stand outside of it, that it exists for you, not around you, that you can step in when you need it, step out when you don't, and nothing about it will follow you beyond that moment. That's the quiet assumption behind creation, that making something gives you ownership, not just over how it functions, but over how it affects you. But the story of Daedalus doesn't follow that idea all the way through. Because Daedalus didn't fail because he couldn't build. He failed because he built something that didn't need him anymore. Something that functioned so completely on its own that once he became part of it, he was no longer the one in control. And that difference between controlling something and being controlled by it is where the story really begins. Daedalus was known for solving problems other people couldn't solve. Not through strength, not through force, but through understanding. He saw patterns where other people saw confusion. He understood how pieces fit together, how structures held, how systems behaved once they were set in motion. He could take something complicated and make it function. And that kind of ability changes how people see you. Because once people believe you can fix anything, they stop asking whether something should exist and start assuming you'll find a way to make it work. And that shift is subtle, but it changes your role entirely. You're no longer deciding what exists, you're deciding how it exists. And once you're in that position, it becomes easier to focus on solving the problem than questioning whether the problem should exist at all. And that's how Daedalus ends up working for King Minos. Minos doesn't ask for something temporary. He asks for something absolute, a prison that cannot be escaped. Not something guarded, not something enforced, not something that depends on strength or constant attention. Something that works on its own. Something that removes the possibility of failure through design. A structure that contains perfectly, without needing to be maintained. And Daedalus approaches it the way he approaches everything else. He doesn't question it. He doesn't hesitate. He focuses on the challenge, on the structure, on the solution. He builds the labyrinth. The labyrinth isn't just a maze. It's not something you can memorize. It's not something that becomes easier the longer you're inside it. It removes orientation itself. Every path leads to another path. Every turn feels like progress, but doesn't actually move you forward. It creates the illusion of movement while quietly keeping you in place. You can walk for hours, for days, for as long as you have the strength to continue, and still end up exactly where you started without realizing it. It doesn't trap you through force. It traps you by removing your ability to understand where you are. And once that's gone, everything else follows. Nothing gets out. And that's the point. From the outside, that looks like perfection. Like Daedalus did exactly what he was asked to do. He created something flawless, something complete, something that holds without weakness. And that kind of creation doesn't just solve a problem. It removes the possibility of the problem ever returning. It feels final. But that's also where the problem begins. Because Daedalus doesn't remain outside of what he built. At some point, he and his son Icarus become prisoners of the labyrinth. Not because something failed, not because something broke, because it worked exactly the way it was designed to work. And that's the part that changes everything. Because now Daedalus is no longer the one observing the system. He's inside it. And everything that made it effective now applies to him in the same way it applies to everything else. He understands it. He knows how it was built. He knows the intention behind every turn, every path, every decision embedded within it. But none of that gives him an advantage anymore, because the labyrinth doesn't respond to intention. It responds to structure. And structure doesn't change just because the creator is inside it. And that's where something uncomfortable starts to take shape. Because it's easy to believe that understanding something gives you control over it. That no matter how complex something becomes, you'll always be able to step outside of it. But the labyrinth shows something different. It shows that once something is built well enough, it doesn't need your understanding anymore. It doesn't need your presence. It operates independently. And if you're inside it, you're not above it, you're part of it. If you like looking at these stories a little differently, please consider subscribing. And that idea doesn't stay contained to the story. Because people build things all the time that start as tools and slowly become environments. Systems that begin as ways to create stability, to create direction, to create something that feels manageable. Careers that begin as opportunities and slowly become expectations. Routines that begin as discipline and slowly become identity. Structures that begin as support and slowly become limitation. At first, they do exactly what they're supposed to do. They reduce uncertainty. They give you something to rely on. They create a path that feels clear. And that feels like control. That feels like progress. That feels like you're doing something right. But over time, something shifts. Because the thing you built to support you starts to define you. It starts to shape your decisions in ways you don't immediately notice. It starts to narrow what feels possible. And that shift doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel like something breaking. It feels like consistency, like responsibility, like doing what you're supposed to be doing. But if you step back far enough, it starts to look different. It starts to look like something you can't easily leave. And that's where Daedalus finds himself. He can't walk out. He can't retrace the path. He can't outthink something that was designed specifically to prevent that. So he does what he has always done. He builds again. Not another structure. A way out of the last one. Wings. The solution follows the same logic as everything else he's created. If the system can't be escaped from within, then you create something that exists outside of it. You change the environment. You create a new path entirely. And for a moment, that probably feels like control again. Like he solved the problem. Like he stepped back into the role he understands. But even that comes with limits. Don't fly too high. Don't fly too low. That warning matters more than it seems, because even in escape, there are still rules, still boundaries, still consequences. And that's the part that's easy to overlook. Daedalus doesn't escape systems. He replaces one with another. From the labyrinth to the sky. From one structure to another that looks different but functions the same way. Because control doesn't actually disappear. It changes form. And that's where the story begins to deepen. What looks like escape isn't always freedom. And what feels like freedom isn't always without limits. The wings Daedalus builds are not a complete removal of the system he was trapped in, but a transition into another one. They come with conditions, with boundaries that must be followed precisely if they are going to work at all. They are another structure, another set of rules that exist whether they are acknowledged or not. And that is the part Icarus fails to recognize. Not because he lacks understanding, but because something changes in the moment. The experience of flight creates a sense of freedom that makes those limits feel unnecessary, as if they no longer apply. And that shift in perception is enough to break everything, not because the system itself failed, but because it was ignored. The system does not depend on belief to function. It does not adjust itself based on what someone feels in the moment. It continues to operate the same way regardless, and that is where the cost appears. Not just in the failure of the wings, but in everything that led to their creation. The labyrinth did not simply trap Daedalus physically. It placed him in a position where every solution required another structure, another system, another set of constraints that had to be understood and followed. Each attempt to regain control introduced something new that carried its own limitations, and over time, those layers began to define what was possible rather than expand it. This is where the story begins to move away from mythology and into something more familiar. Most people do not realize when they have built something they are living inside of. It happens gradually, one decision at a time, one commitment layered onto the next. Each step feels logical when it is made. It feels necessary. It feels like progress. And for a time, it is. That is what makes it convincing. The structure works. It creates stability, direction, and a sense of control that feels earned. But over time, those same structures begin to limit what can be changed, what can be left behind, and even what can be questioned. The shift does not happen all at once. It is not a moment of collapse or obvious failure. It is something quieter, a hesitation when considering a different path, a resistance that appears when trying to step outside of what has already been built, a sense that leaving is more difficult than expected. And that is when it becomes clear that the structure is no longer just something being used. It has become something being lived inside of. That is what makes it difficult to recognize. It does not feel like a trap. It feels like a series of choices that made sense at the time. And because those choices were made intentionally, it becomes harder to question them. If something was built carefully, deliberately, then it must be right. That belief is what holds it in place, even when it begins to limit what is possible, even when it starts to define identity instead of support it, even when it becomes something that cannot be easily stepped away from. That is the question the story ultimately leaves behind. Not whether Daedalus was right to build what he built, but whether he ever truly escaped it. Because he did not simply walk away, he carried it forward, into the next solution, into the next system, into the next set of consequences. The labyrinth did not end when he left it. It continued in the way he approached everything that came after. That may be the central idea of the story, that creation does not end when something is finished. It continues in how it shapes decisions, how it defines direction, and how it limits or expands what comes next. And once something is built well enough, it no longer exists as something external. It becomes something lived within. At that point, the question is no longer whether it works, but whether it allows you to move beyond it at all.